Hi, thanks for tuning in to our Practical Nerds weekly podcast. I'm Shub, and together with my partner and co host Patrick, we normally invest in founders in design, construction, renovation, and logistics technology. Many of our friends in the ecosystem wanted us to start a podcast on the built world, and in return, we decided to honor their request with a show about nothing at all. Hey Patrick, been a bit of a break for us. How have you been?
Just a short break, though. Just a short
Just a
break.
short break. Yeah.
Been doing good. I had fun posting this week again the top 100, top 50, top something lists.
Your
When you
favorite,
backtest them, are pretty bad.
full-time job, I presume.
Yeah, for the people, creators of those lists. Yeah,
Yes.
that's right. How about you?
I've been having fun of my own kind, I guess. Trying to resolve. It's interesting and perhaps a discussion for another time. Trying to find common ground with expectations, ego, greed, etc. Trying to find common ground when all these emotions come into play.
Has that been an internal struggle, or were other people involved?
Oh, that's you never know. I guess that's like that's the mystery for our viewers and listeners to guess, I suppose.
Nice. No, I can attest that other people were involved. It was not an internal struggle for sure.
Yeah, thankfully.
Great. So now we're going down under today.
Down under, yes. Place we haven't ventured before in Practical Nerds, but we have, of course, done at Fundamental. So what are we talking about, Patrick?
So since you are actually the Thunder from Down Under in the Fundamental team, and you're covering Australia, actually Australia, New Zealand, so the Oceanian market for us, and we've been very impressed over the years with the high concentration of high quality founders and companies in construction tech. Let's say AEC tech, to include also the 3D computer aided design part that we cover from Australia.
Yeah.
So because we've been very impressed by that, and you leading the spearhead here, we felt like, hey, let's flip the globe on its head and take a look to Australia and share with each other here what makes that so special.
Yeah. It's quite fascinating, and I think we could go one of two ways. One of course, the experiences we have had. We've so far done 3 investments in Australia. I feel like we've come close to doing maybe 1 or 2 more. So already have a bit of experience, and so far I think the early cohort has looked quite promising, what we've seen in Australia. But also I think we could choose to take a more top-down approach. And I guess what better way to start top-down than looking at unicorns in construction, right? And Patrick, you had started this exercise late last year when you looked at all the unicorns we have in construction tech.
Yeah.
Admittedly, much fewer than there should be, but nevertheless, a dramatically rising number over the last few years. And there are some very interesting observations there, which I further recently dug in an article of my own, where I looked at how construction tech in India has risen. But I think anyone who's gone through either Patrick's piece or mine it would not be lost on them to realize that Australia actually features very prominently as an anomaly in this list.
2 unicorns out of 17 in AEC tech / construction tech to date, not counting those that have been going defunct. So we're not counting those. 17, and 2 of them out of Australia. Sure. Which ones are those?
Those are Safety Culture, which I believe is the world leader in offering like a SaaS solution for safety solutions for construction, as well as a few other heavy industries. And the second is Econex, which has since got acquired by Oracle. Again, one of the, I would say maybe the top 2 or 3 ERP solutions or for project management in construction, adopted worldwide. Now, of course, as part of the Oracle platform as well. And I think what is fascinating in that list, just to also impress upon everyone else what this means. Someone may say, hey, 2 out of 17, how notable is that? The only countries with more unicorns at this point are US and India.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, if you go as far back, go back just a few years, it was literally only the US with more unicorns. So Australia not only stands out for being the country with the third largest number of unicorns in construction tech, but also very consistent in the sense it's not like India, for example, has just suddenly emerged, I would say, if I may say so. Whereas Australia sort of consistently featured even as an early as well as a consistent top country. I mean, the other countries we see featuring in the list of unicorn creators, if I may call it that, in construction tech, that would be China and France. They're much larger economies than Australia, and so are, of course, US and India. So even in terms of if you compare GDP versus the rate of unicorn creation, if that were to be a metric, Australia is a surprisingly efficient market in terms of conversion of GDP to unicorns.
I'll give you the numbers, right? I mean, Australia, 26 million population,
Mm-hmm.
USA, 320, 330.
Yeah.
Round. So that's 8%.
Yeah.
Of the
And of
USA.
course, if you do the comparison with India, that will be an even more insane conversion.
Exactly.
Right.
And GDP, so Australia 1.6 trillion, US 26 trillion. So that's like 6% of the US economy, right?
Mm-hmm.
And yet you have 2 unicorns in construction tech, while the US has only like 3 times that.
Yeah. It's
very
quite
remarkable.
fascinating. Quite fascinating, and again, surprisingly underappreciated, I would say, in the world of VC as to how not necessarily dominant, but how important Australia is to construction tech.
So what is it that these Australian contact community is doing so well? I mean, you've engaged with so many down under.
Mm-hmm. So actually, it's quite fascinating. I think the first thing to remind ourselves, again, for those who are not familiar, so it's this peculiar combination, and geography, interestingly, plays a fascinating role in this. So Australia, of course, aligns itself with the Western world. It's of course, an advanced economy and a mature economy in every sense of the word. But of course, geographically, it's not really, does not have proximity to the West. In a strange way, what this means, even the sources of venture capital or other sorts of capital which would fund tech innovations, there's a weird sort of isolation away from, for example, Western-oriented investors, right? Again, it's a bit, maybe it sounds very primitive, but remarkably, it has actually a very real bearing on money flows. The other thing is, from a geographical proximity, it is, of course, Australia happens to be much closer to Asia, especially Southeast Asia. But as you can imagine, the economies and the culture and the setting of the entrepreneurs and the businesses is extremely different, which is why there's not really a natural spillover of capital, for example, from Asia to Australia or vice versa. So interestingly, the economy sort of acts on its own in isolation, much like the wildlife, for instance, right? So in many ways, even if you, I don't know why I said that, but I guess let's run with it.
Yeah, I'm thinking of big tarantulas.
Big tarantulas. I mean, I was thinking more like kangaroos and stuff, but let's go with big tarantulas. Right? So it's quite fascinating how profound an effect this has. So this does actually several things to what you see in businesses and founders that come up in Australia. So first, for a lot of companies in Australia, especially the founders who get it, they know pretty much from day zero that they need to be relevant to at least one more market outside Australia, if not to the whole globe. Right? And I think that brings an interesting sense of a combination of humility, a combination of bracing for a challenge, right? So you cannot lean back and assume that if you just serve your home market, you're sorted.
Right.
As, for example, what you'd see in actually any of the markets we just described, US or China or India or Europe. So in Australia, with very few exceptions, you have to think global from day one.
That sounds like the situation that Israeli founders from Estonia. Estonia is the country with the highest unicorn per population rate.
Oh, I did not know that.
Founders from those economies, they would be in a very similar situation. It sounds quite similar.
Cool factor on Estonia. I did not know that, actually. I would have guessed, I guess, one of the Nordic countries, maybe Sweden, but I didn't know that about Estonia.
Close enough.
Yeah. That's pretty cool. Yeah, so I think that's something where Australia, the founders have this global mindset, and which is quite fascinating. And I think probably it's going to sound very weird for an advanced economy and a Western aligned country, because of the geographic distance and the source of venture capital not being being cut off. The VC and the founder ecosystem has evolved to think that capital is actually not very abundant, and they'll have to work hard for every round of capital. Right? Obviously, what I'm describing is the general, exceptions always arise, but this is the norm, as in funding is not taken for granted. It is assumed that the process of a capital raise is going to be tough, and you need to respect capital raise as a process, and therefore discover your price, and not necessarily come with a sense of entitlement, if I may go of saying that, right? And I think it brings with it a certain sense of decorum and respect to the aspect of building a business with frugality. Because keep in mind, what you're bringing together two constraints, which one may say are not are putting double pressure on the business. You need to be global from day one, but you also need to do it with much fewer resources than would be available to your counterparts in other parts of the world.
Right.
So I think this leads to a fascinating combination where, because you have a constraint of resources problem, you kind of figure out how to do more with less.
That is indeed it's a very important factor that you're pointing out. And is that specific or even more pronounced from what you've seen in the construction tech relevant sectors? Is that something you've seen?
So yes, but so the reason I'm smiling is there's a weird dichotomy there. So in the sense, it is heightened because construction in general is not as well funded throughout the world, but the disparity is more apparent in Australia because, and here's one of the possible reasons why Australia might be outshining disproportionately in the world of construction tech. Construction and mining, and they're complementary, and they're extremely important in the Australian ecosystem,
Right.
Australian economy, like disproportionately more so than other large economies. So when you combine a country with an advanced economy with a disproportionately large construction and mining oriented economy with less capital available because it's construction, then you again have a doubling of the constraint.
That is fascinating. See, that's something that, like you point out, the distance is very far. I mean, not culturally necessarily.
Yeah.
But from a time zone perspective, of course, just spatial perspective, etc. Yeah. So you're not necessarily seeing these things from the outside in. So how do these? I find it fascinating how you're pointing out these constraints. It almost sounds like, hey, this is old school venture. That's like one of the terms that come to my mind when you describe it that way, and I'm loving it. So how does this translate to the cohort of construction tech, AEC tech founders that you find in Australia? Like, what traits are specific that you're observing?
So I think firstly, because of the reasons I mentioned, the ecosystem is actually very, very tight. The construction tech ecosystem in Australia is very tight. If you find a high quality, or let's say even let's say relatively high quality construction tech founder, it is almost impossible that that person would not know all the other high quality construction tech founders in Australia. It is literally that connected, well connected. That's how closely knit the ecosystem is.
And then when we think of founder traits, right? So, founders have different, profiles, personalities, archetypes.
Yeah.
Have you noticed any like recurring or a higher share, I should say, of specific traits in Australia than you have seen perhaps in other communities?
So I would say there's definitely humility incorporated to a great degree. Humility not necessarily in the sense of imploding into yourself or being deflated, in the sense where, as I mentioned, the capital raise is treated with great deal of respect and decorum, and I think it's used also to, it's seen as, especially if you're talking about the earliest rounds, quite often it's seen as an existential step which will unlock the ability of the business to go global or to expand into another market. So it is literally that is what stands between the business being, let's say, a relatively small, perhaps irrelevant business in Australia to something which could truly be a global venture-backed success. So I think that is seen as very important, and that leads to a case where I think founders tend to be more humble, but also look at sales and the venture process. Both, by the way, in Australian companies, both have to happen simultaneously, because you need to sell to investors both in Australia and globally from day one, perhaps, and to prospective businesses or prospective clients, again, all over the world. So whether you like it or not, you need to find a way for either you yourself as a founder to be marketable around the world, or your product to do it for you immediately from all around the world. You don't have the luxury of testing it in small groups. So that
almost explain to me how that leads to the humility, because that almost, I mean, not to mention specific nationalities or cultural backgrounds here, so I'm leaving it abstract. But so another way to react to that kind of challenge would be the old "fake it till you make it" mantra. But it sounds like you're not finding that much in the Australian content community.
So I think that look, obviously that happens every now and then, but I think the belief, what I've seen is, there is not enough surplus in the ecosystem in terms of available pools of capital for a critical mass of founders to feel confident with the fake it till you make it strategy. As in, the risk is higher.
I see what you're saying.
The risk is higher, and the ecosystem is too tight. The ecosystem is too tight.
You only get 3 shots. And if those 3 shots know that you've been faking it, okay.
Exactly. Then everyone knows. Then everyone knows that this particular individual is a faker.
Oh, that is fascinating.
Right? And that leads me to my first observation. I think in general, if you were to collectively take a cohort, not pointing out, comparing one individual versus the other, I think as a cohort, Australian founders, I would say, are amongst the best, perhaps the best salespeople I have seen as a group represented through a nation.
Sorry, I just want to call this out. By best, you don't mean the most salesy. You mean the most effective.
Yes. And the reason, some may say, hey, how can you say that? So my benchmark for saying that they are the best is that they have to, by definition, solve for selling not in their home market, but in 2, 3, maybe other markets as well. And they have to solve for it early in their journey, quite often with less capital than their peers in other markets. And they are able to do it, which for me is a true validation of someone being a great salesperson.
Okay.
Right? I mean, Patrick, you tell me, I mean, how many times have we spoken with investors who you and I are familiar with? We talk to them about an Australian company and they're like, oh, we'll see them when they're, when they finally launch in the US or finally launch in the UK. And the conversation just ends right there. Right?
All the time.
All the
time.
Talk
about it. Yeah.
So that's what they're up against.
Fascinating. Yeah. Okay. So humility, 1. Sales effectiveness, 2. That's 2 very defining traits, the way you've made your experience. Is there a third one about talk to me about the approach to fundraising? Is I guess that's a little bit in the context of humility, but perhaps you can give us a little bit of a further insight here.
As you have seen, I've so far been gushing about them, so maybe it's time to also look at what could be the other side to the story, right? So I think sometimes what you see, and again, I think just for parity's sake, if we compare with, for example, if we compare them with founders in more mature venture ecosystems, like say US, India, Western Europe, etc. I think there the art of the VC founder interaction is better understood or more standardized to the point where the top tier founders know what the expectations are and get it, if you know what I mean. So they already are familiar with the rules of the dance. So they already know how to do the steps with you. So quite often with Australia, because the sample set is so much more limited, I feel like the rules of the dance have to first be taught, which, as you can imagine, because of the nature of our profession, it's not like someone's going to sit and say, hey, you tell me this and then I reply with that, right? So the best you can do is maybe ask guiding questions and stuff like that and hope that does the trick. And with a lot of good founders, that is sufficient. But with many others, even very capable founders, the art, because it's unfortunately an art, the nature of this interaction, it's something that is either alien or unfamiliar, or they haven't had enough practice with it. And
That
therefore,
almost sounds like you as Shub down under. One effective filter for you is to ask every founder, "Hey, how many other VCs have you talked to?"
Yes. And by the way, you'll be surprised, especially for founders outside, say, Sydney and Melbourne in Australia, it'll be a very small list. It'll be a surprisingly small list.
I see.
Yeah. I mean, I guess we don't find, I wonder if there'll be a merit to doing a list like that, where you find an advanced economy and in terms of concentration of domestic capital. I think Australia will stand out as one of the anomalies in such a list.
With a too big mismatch.
Exactly. Yes. Yeah. And which is why I think this is the downside where, look, I think in many other markets, people, the founders just get it. And therefore you can skip a lot of the other aspect of figuring out the person and talk business. I think the Australian founders, because of the other aspects we discussed, they get the business side of it, but they need some help with the art of the interaction, which, as we've discussed in other episodes, also goes a long way in building trust and the true intimacy, if I may call it that, of the VC founder relationship.
So let me now share how I've been experiencing some of this from afar. So one of the beautiful things of working together with you, Adam, our entire team, Seb and the gang, in a global but vertical firm, and everybody takes care of their continent, but in the end, every week, multiple times we come together as a global team, we discuss what we've been seeing, what we've been experiencing, etc. So the beauty of our model is that I feel always quite close to what you're experiencing, but I get to judge it from afar. So in an interaction, and trust me, it's especially true in the founder to investor interaction, there's a lot of words, but there's also a lot of actions. And so when you're afar, it's much easier to judge a person by the action only because you don't get to hear the words.
Absolutely.
So when that happens, when you share stuff from Australia over the years, which, it's now been 6 years for us in Fundamental, a lot of interesting actions that I would say I have seen. And one of the most recurring or repeatable ones that from afar, judging by the actions I have noted, is that I think the angel community is actually not helping the founders in contact down under set the right expectations or prepare for the dance. In fact, I've noticed more often than not that when angels had been involved, all of a sudden outrageous expectations get involved as well, which is something that in the mature venture ecosystems, it's usually the other way around. The angels are extremely useful to get a founder have the ears on the ground or on the train tracks and to expect what's coming.
Yes.
And in Down Under over the 6 years, I've made this experience from afar with you, more than I like in construction-tech specifically, that the angels said no, I mean, go for this outrageous number, or this outrageous multiple. But perhaps you've perceived it differently being in the discussion.
No, I think you're spot on. So I think we've definitely had cases where we've had great conversations, but things sort of come to a stalemate because there is, from our vantage point, like an arbitrary line in the sand. And that arbitrary line in the sand has got created for, I would say, reasons which should not really be given importance in a conversation of this kind between VCs and founders, where some XYZ person has said that this is the norm for what should happen, etc. And for some reason that becomes a line in the sand, right? It's not like a fluid conversation point where you use it for. So this is what I mean as like the founders sometimes not understanding the dynamic, where I think they sometimes go at it too hard and not understanding that it's a dance. It's not like, hey, now I've put down my thing and now I need you to either respond or accept. That art, I think, I feel it's still a bit raw and not quite evolved yet in Australia.
Got it.
Yeah.
What would you tell me when I asked you, hey, how do you judge the level of product competence from Australia? What would you tell me if I asked you that?
So good question. So look, the sample set I work with is of course quite different from the sample set you have with the founders in Europe, different from the founders you see in the US. Within the sample set and the geographies I cover, frankly, it's best in class.
Which is just for the listeners, which is the emerging markets in Asia, Africa, and then Australia comes on top for you.
That's right. Right. So I would say for product and engineering, I would say it's best in class, especially if you're looking at high UX software, design oriented solutions. I'm thinking if AI can also be included there. Maybe yes and no. I would say there's some early signs that it could also be best in class AI. Although I would say in general the jury is out on what best in class AI in construction tech, at least from these markets, what it looks like. So I think it's too early to form that conclusion. But certainly enterprise or SMB software and design oriented solutions, I would say pretty good. And as in, I think they also Australian founders are also very good, referencing back what I said earlier, in quickly moving from like a concept stage to a commercialization stage. I would say again, they're very, very good at quickly making the transition and not being stuck forever in like an iteration phase.
So this is hearsay. So I'll preface it with I don't have firsthand data to corroborate that, but someone who led around in safety culture once told me that back then, and this is years ago, when safety culture was significantly smaller than it is today, told me that what impressed that person, that investor, the most to invest was that it had reached significant ARR scale. I'm not going to reveal the number, but really substantial ARR without a single salesperson.
Yeah.
And it was all like a product-led motion where enterprise customers would onboard themselves into the product. And then the safety culture team at the time, might still be the case today, had a very effective customer service team that would follow up and then basically help the customer through the setups, basically make sure they activate properly. Post-activation, they bring their templates into safety culture, etc. And that speaks to me again, this is an anecdote, but it speaks to me about a product first mindset with perhaps the inherent sales skills that you were pointing out, or that you are seeing as sort of perhaps a mini pattern even, rather than flooding your go-to-market motion with resources. It's interesting in the context of everything you've told me.
Yes, I would agree. I think the one or two instances in the last year or so where we have gotten very close to adding to our Australian portfolio, again, I would say very similar set of descriptions would apply there. In fact, if you recall, there was a company we were talking about last year. Very similar story. I think we even, in the midst of our discussion, we're trying to estimate the number of salespeople and found that it was like a surprisingly small number for the coverage they had.
I know which company.
It was a very founder-led sales process. Yeah, I think that also, I mean, in a weird way, this is something we normally talk about with our Asian portfolio and not really about other markets. In a weird way, that leads to like early signs of being a very business style venture. And what I mean by that is a venture which is constantly measuring itself on, hey, does the P&L look good? Does the cash flows look good? Etc. So it leads to that style of building a business.
Yeah, the other style would be one that we've seen for too long in the markets that have most venture funding, which I would call gas station mentality, meaning you're not building a business to build a business, but you're just hopping from gas station to gas station of fundraising, filling up the tank from the fundraising. I don't think I've said it on here, but one of my favorite things I say about cash flow to founders I work with is the best source of cash flow is your customer.
Yeah.
The second best source is your bank, and only the third best source is your venture investor.
Yes.
That seems to be a mindset that you experience among ConTech founders in Australia a lot, if I hear you correctly.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I would say that is definitely one of the strongest facets to their skill set. Yeah.
Great. Talk to me about perhaps about the models or the themes. So, and I want to contextualize this. So I've been asked actually relatively frequently in the last 3 or 4 months by other people, hey, Patrick, which markets in the world actually dominate in specific parts of construction tech? And like on a high level, there's much more nuance than I'm gonna make it sound like now, but on a high level, if you want to learn about procurement, supply chain, marketplaces in construction tech, go to India. If you want to learn about construction site software and software around the workflows of the construction site, go to the US. And in my opinion, actually the most talented product minded robotics founders for construction tech we've seen in Europe. Not to say they are not elsewhere, just as a cluster, as a hub, right? What is the equivalent in Australia? What is Australia's like hub competence in ConTech?
I would say software for SMBs and independent professionals, either administered through something resembling an enterprise style sales motion, or something closer to DIY. Not exact, doesn't need to be DIY, but something where small independently acting users are discovering and acting on it across the world. I think on that, Australia has a pretty good representation, and actually a decent chunk of founders in construction Australia would already fit this description.
Talk to me about Calctree. It fits perfectly into it, and it's such a fascinating story and company. So perhaps we will use it as an example of what you just said. Sure.
So Calctree is a company we backed last year as part of the early round. I think it's a very powerful vision. If I again put on my VC 101 hat of resorting to analogies, think of it like Notion meets GitHub for AEC teams or AEC professionals, where again, to peel the curtain back a little bit, what you're doing as an engineer, maybe a process engineer, maybe a structural engineer, maybe any of the other engineers, engineering functions dealing with these structures, you're probably doing your calculations. The most popular piece of software, by the way, would be Excel, where you'll probably use a coding language to set the formula up. And because you're interacting with other professionals, quite often from other engineering disciplines, each of them will separately interact with like a static sheet, which will then need
locally,
which will then have to go through quality control and interdisciplinary review, etc. For more complex, very highly specific calculations, you'll get specific pieces of software which can't be modified. All you do is just input data and you get an output. So what Calctree is doing is firstly making it more open and collaborative, in the sense in real time, teams as well as professionals can interact with the outside world on calculation templates, on the formula going into it, change it, have it up for peer review or third-party review. And you can also solicit calculation templates. For example, one popular theme we're seeing now is professionals and firms, or I should say professionals, sorry, it's targeted at individual professionals soliciting timber-oriented calculations. Right? And I see it as becoming a very powerful source of information being stored, but also being simplified in a way where you don't need to go through clunky pieces of software which are local and not collaborative. But also everyone gets smarter through the power of a shared information repository and version control.
I've seen the product, and I think it is from a tech stack perspective as well as UX, well built, and it fits really into what we've been discussing today, the quality of product and engineering coming out of the Australian contact community. I think that's really an example of exactly that.
Yeah, and an overwhelming majority of the users are not in Australia. In fact, I think Australian users, I don't remember the latest, but I think it may be less than a quarter.
Yeah.
So the vast majority is from outside, and which is how it has to be. I mean, that's what these
global day one
Caltri has signed up for, and so is the case with many of the best Australian founders. They accept it as a day zero situation.
Amazing. So any travel plans down under, Shub? I know you've been pre-COVID, but not since.
Not since. I keep getting asked that by our portfolio. I am actually considering going later this year.
I
It's
envy
been
you.
long overdue.
Yeah, I envy you.
Oh, absolutely.
Very, very cool. So this was, for me, very informative again about the Australian construction tech and AEC tech community. We really hope to do, even more down under, because the concentration of high quality teams is actually perhaps the highest among any of the markets that we cover in relation to capita, to population.
Absolutely. And if you're a high quality founder, I'll be very happy to, and you think you maybe have set your line in the sand a bit too firmly, I'll be happy to maybe share a few tips on how to do the dance with me.
Nice. I like that. And as I learned right around the holidays, that if you can't dance, don't blame the dance court. That's the Indian. Was it the Hindi saying or the Bengali saying?
The Hindi one.
The Hindi one.
Yeah.
I can recommend that episode. I think that was 2 episodes ago. We talked about that.
Yeah, I want to say 21.
Oh, you got a good memory.
Yeah.
So let's do our little ritual here, coming to the end. When you look at your calendar next week, what excites you?
So there's a couple of opportunities I'm digging into. One also happens to be from Australia. So not to that firm. Both interesting themes. I think one is around the theme of trying to be like a new age improvement upon an existing incumbent. I don't want to reveal the name, otherwise reveal the name of the incumbent. Otherwise, I think it'll be spilling too many beans. The other is trying to, I guess, organize what I see as a systematic mega shift around electrification, decentralization of the grid, and sourcing of components for it. It's a topic we have spoken before.
Yeah.
And I think an interesting approach to solve for the components and infrastructure going into that shift.
Okay, I'd like to learn about that.
Yeah.
On my end, I'm looking forward to a board meeting in Granit, one of our portfolio companies. The company is really doing, I think, a lot of things coming very well together. So I'm looking forward to hear the latest.
Nice.
It should be fun.
Excellent.
Good. Well, listen, thanks for sharing. This has been really insightful. Perhaps we do an update after you return from Australia later this year.
Oh, absolutely. I would love that.
Cool. Yeah. All right, Shub. I wish you a happy weekend.
Happy weekend, sir.
See you soon. Ciao.
Yeah.